So I think we ended up with a slide on, when did you two start coming to TUC again?
Early 2000s.
Early 2000s. So you
Same as Pastor Johan.
Pastor Johan 2010s. Okay, so this would have been before your time. And but you heard about the preschool that was here?
I was
Your
I was a treasurer here. The preschool is still going on.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have a preschool on the 4th floor, and then I think Allison Young, she's Richard Young was a professor of mine at Princeton Seminary, and then his wife, and they told me they had like moms had like a playgroup for their kids, and then the idea came to formally begin a preschool at TUC, and this was started in the 90s. And its brochure described its vision that in a Christian non-competitive community atmosphere, children can blossom to their fullest potential. So, do you two have children?
No, not until much later.
Oh, okay.
But I knew they had different classes, like koala class.
Yeah, that's cute. And so each class was 10 to 20 kids. And they had a teacher and an assistant teacher. The 3-year-old were called pandas, 4-year-old teddy, and grizzly bears, and 5-year-olds were polar bears.
Oh, okay.
And what was the bear you said?
It wasn't one of those, so those sound better.
And then, so the 4th floor was preschool during the week, and 3rd floor terrace was a playground. And there was an escape sliding connecting the 4th and 3rd floors. And then the brochure mentions that supplementing our curriculum are a variety of enrichment activities, including library, Bible stories, kinder music, I'm guessing that's a music program, and then Big Bear, Little Bear Day. And then the preschool later expands to include kindergarten, and it becomes a member of the Japan Council of International Schools also. If you remember, you got a priority in enrollment and 20% discount. And in its heyday, it had hired 8 teachers to serve more than 60 children. And in 1988, the council minutes states that the preschool started out as an experiment, has been very successful, and has become a major church activity. And in 1991, the council minutes mentions that if it weren't for the 47 million yen that the preschool was bringing in, the church cannot operate, as the pledges did not cover the expenses. And I think the preschool ran for about 25 years, and I heard we were one of the pioneers of this kind of, the preschool market got competitive. Other schools, they came in and sunsetted the program eventually. That's what the brochure like. And then I also read in the council minutes that during the Gulf War, the child of the Iraqi ambassador was used to come to TUC preschool, so we had to get extra security for the son of the ambassador. And have you heard of Logos? Was that around when you came? What's Logos? So that was another big part of the youth programming at TUC. And it's kind of Allison Young, when her children were little, she started the preschool, and then as her children grew up, she became the director of the Wednesday afternoon program called Logos. Pastor Greg Benwick in the 1980s had started this program. And this was a midweek program for grades 1 to 8, which seeks to offer an experience of Christian life through Bible study, worship through choir and drama, recreation, and a meal shared together. And about 30 kids regularly attended, from 4:30 to 7:30 p.m. on Wednesdays, and at the end of the semester they would perform a biblically themed musical, including this Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Do you know this musical? Oh, you've seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Oh, okay. I haven't. I'm sure the production wasn't this grand, but sure it was a lot of fun for kids. And I also heard the sexton we used to live here was very involved with musicals. I can't remember his name. I don't think kids do musicals anymore, right? So I think there was much more programming for youth and kids before. And in 1994 May, council minutes mentions 2 Logos members in the hall apologizing to the council for making a damage done to the wall near the elevator. So I don't know what they were doing, running around, throwing things. I hope they were not fighting. And you probably both know Daniel Phoenix. He said he was very involved with the program in the 1990s. And he started getting involved because when he came back, he was here as a child, and then he came back in the 90s to be an actor. But when he couldn't have a gig, Pastor Jeff let him stay at his house for a month in the summer while Pastor Jeff was away on leave. And so Phoenix said this was a way for him to say thank you to the church. And he taught kids how to make twist balloons. He ran around the basement with them playing games, and older kids would listen to music. And I also talk about the outreach in the chapter 4 during the 80s and 90s. And I think it's still true, but then the outreach and mission committee, they're authorized to tithe 10% of church's income go to charities. And in 1986, TUC donated 12 million yen to 40 projects across the world, but most of them were in Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. I wonder how much of that was kind of a colonial relations. Korea was a Japanese colony, and the Philippines was an American colony, so it's a way of doing reparations for this community, I think. And in 1998, some of the 33 organizations, so I think this number shrinks over time, and I don't think we have as many organizations we support anymore these days. But some of the organizations that received the most funds from us were Asian Bull Institute, we had ongoing ties to them going back to their founding. Marino Alcohol and Drug Addiction Rehabilitation Center. These are the first Catholic foreign missionary organization from the U.S. Marino brothers and sisters. TEL, Tokyo English Lifeline. We also have a lot of TUC members involved with that. I'll talk about that in a later chapter. Precious Jewels, which was a Christ-centered ministry to needy families living in the Manila slums. The Philippine Self-Help Foundation, founded by Richard Foster. I'll talk more about Richard later slides. And then we also sponsored the Moscow Protestant chaplaincy in Russia, a peace center for the blind in Jerusalem. So our funds literally went around the world. And I think this was when Tokyo was the largest city in the world, one of the most affluent cities in the world. So used to be, yeah, 80s and 90s before the bubble burst. And yeah, this is a picture from Japan Times, ARI students and staff. And then that's the logo of TAL. And as you know, feel free to stop me for any questions or comments.
Can you peel it down just a bit? The screen is kind of if it's hard, it's okay. That's okay. Joined TUC in 1985.
Yeah, joined TUC in 85 and stayed with us until he left for the Philippines in 2011. But he still keeps in touch with Wally and then Mary Foster. And then Wally and he used to have like a daily calls. I don't know if they used to like a daily checkup that they used to have. He was born in Belgium, educated in England, and he used to manage sports clubs in Europe. And then he decided to go on this round the world trip, and he stopped by in Japan. It was supposed to be a week-long stop, but his friends got him set up with a job and a home, so he ended up staying decades. And he found TUC soon after he arrived here, and Associate Pastor Tepi Masushima, I think she was here in the 80s. She recognized Richard's leadership and encouraged him to join the Young Adult Group and the Outreach Committee. And he said Richard said during his 1986 visit to the Philippines, he experienced love and joy in the home which filled a void in his own life. And in 1987, he founded the Philippine Self-Help Foundation, which pioneered microfinance loans to the needy in the Philippines. And that's what he's doing full-time now. His last project on the Outreach Committee was chairing the allocation of an anonymous donation of $300,000 in 2009. You probably remember this.
I didn't appreciate that that was the number, because that's all from TUC?
Yeah. So it was like one anonymous donation. So I think the outreach committee set up a task force just to allocate that. And at TUC, Richard taught many classes about the Philippines, and he led 6 TUC mission trips, attended by 4 pastors and more than 16 members. And I think in the 80s, 90s, and even into 2000s, we used to go on a lot more mission trips around the world, Southeast Asia. I think we even went to Kenya. And there was also kind of a study pilgrimages to the Middle East, Turkey, Israel, Palestine. And then Moon also gets kind of a revamp during the 1990s. And according to the annual report from 95-96, since October 1993, Outreach and Mission and the Women's Society have coordinated a volunteer project to feed the homeless in our local Shibuya community. And Julie Fukuda has been involved with Moon for decades. She said Moon began with the Women's Society serving the homeless in Shinjuku. And then we kind of figured out there are a lot of homeless people nearer to us at TUC. So we shifted the focus to Shibuya. And in 1988, its members were making about 500 rice balls every week to be distributed. And then Paul Fukuda, energetic elder, he also wore many hats at church over the years. He heard that 750 calories were the difference between life and death for the homeless. That really galvanized him to get more involved. And then I think some people think Paul and Julie founded Moon because they were such a huge part of it. But yeah, I was told that they kind of really revitalized the program, made the ministry their own, but it existed before. And then TUC Sexton Kazunori Higuchi-san was also very involved. And Moon begins at Shibuya Station and then expands to Yoyogi Park. And by 1998, there were more than 50 volunteers on the production side, serving more than 60 homeless in Shibuya every day. And every guest received 2 onigiri and a hard boiled egg. And then at 5 a.m., onigiri delivers go out, including the Fukuda family, the Trees family, and then Pastor Dawson's family. Or have any of you been involved with Moon?
Not so much. Here, they do this Saturday.
Oh, when they came here.
And it's, it's with our homeless neighbors because they contribute, they volunteer. It's not for homeless neighbors, with their homeless. There was a discussion on that.
What Moon should stand for?
Yeah, it's with their homeless. You have it right there. And then they had New Year's event. They do Orlando for New Year's. CG.
So you probably know Kudo-san then? Kudo-san? I heard he used to be the chef at a new Italian hotel, and he got recruited. He's part of that. He's one of the leaders of the pet community in Yoyogi Park, and then so Moon kind of asked him to cook for the community. So it's been very involved. I've met him a few times. And Jean Pegosra mentioned how Moon brought invite homeless neighbors to the church on Saturday a month. And she told me a story about she noticed one of the Moon guests wearing an elegant ring. And then so she asked him about it. And he said he got fired from his work and was too embarrassed to tell his wife and daughter, so he became homeless. And Jean asked, so do you still, don't you miss them? And he said he goes to the school and then just sees his daughter play during recess. But yeah, that just seemed like there's something about Japanese culture. It's like not losing face and maybe not disappointing your family that he feels like he needs to be homeless after he lost his job. And then Jean said when TUC opens its doors, all sorts of people are welcome to come in. There is a beautiful, wonderful ministry that we do. And over my interviews with the members of and pastors, a lot of people were not known. Pastor Bruce said during the 2000s it was the most powerful ministry at TUC. And Russell Gessling, preaching during TUC Sunday evening praise service in the 90s. He preached that I love it that once a month over 300 of our homeless neighbors gather at the church and line up for a meal. I love the fact that in doing this we lift high the cross, and that we're in a very clear and concrete way indicate that this 4-story concrete building stands for something very different than what our neighbors stand for. Pastor Eduardo Martinez, probably know him. Yeah, he also told me that he thinks it's lamentable that more luncheons at the church basement have stopped. So there was something prophetic about seeing 100 people line up in the latest shoes, while 150 people line up for a meal at church. So I think just inviting more guests to church stopped during COVID. I don't know if there are discussions concerning that. Members as well as pastors stay out that was for that. And then I talk about the women's leadership at TUC, because in 1983, Pastor Barbara Jenkins retired from church. I think she had her second child, and she began at TUC in the 70s as a intern, and she became an associate pastor, and she remains to this day the longest serving associate pastor, and then the first woman on staff, on pastoral staff. And she wrote in 1983 to the council that I would like to close my full-time ministry in a way that is as joyous and creative as the past 7 years have been, and as affirmative to women in ministry as possible. And then she succeeded later by Yale graduate and Lutheran Pastor Murray Wilkerson. Pastor Murray introduces oral communion to TUC, and her successor, Lutheran Pastor Barbara, continues this tradition. And can you name the pastors here? How many can you two name?
Pastor Randy's on the left.
Yeah, that's Randy.
And the next 2, 3, 4, I don't know, Pastor
Chuck Hasty.
What is it?
Associate Pastor Chuck Hasty.
Okay.
And that's Kathy Matsushima. That was named. That was influential for Richard Foster. That's Jeff Powell. And Murray Wilkinson. That's the Barry Dawson, Bill Eckert, Mandy Stanley, Barbara Lund, and Van Harden. Mandy Stanley. Okay, so
That was the first one when I came.
Oh, she was here. Okay.
And Pastor Matthews. So 1, 2, 3, and 4.
This is for the 140th anniversary of the church in 2012. And then the white robes are Lutherans, and the black are Presbyterians. And in 1986, Marge Winker became the first woman to be the president of TUC. And as you know, we haven't had a female TUC senior pastor yet. Sometime soon we get one. And I end chapter 4, kind of a little bit about Pastor Craig Erickson's time, and he had a doctorate in liturgical theology, studies in theology from the University of Notre Dame. And he had served on the worship committee of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, ECUSA. And so he really revamped worship liturgy during his time here. This is the late 80s and early 90s. And he has this line from his one of these articles that he wrote, that many Christians tend to view the minister as the actor, God as the prompter, and the congregation as the audience. But he says it should actually be the reverse, that the congregation is the actor, the minister is merely the prompter, and that God is the audience. He also articulates that the purpose of worship is both the glorification of God and the equipping of Christians with power to carry out the mission of the church and the world. In 1991, he implements new hymnals and new Bibles in the sanctuary, and he also introduces the contemporary version of the Lord's Prayer. And Gene Wilson told me how Pastor Greg said one Sunday, by next Sunday, we have to memorize the new version of the Lord's Prayer, and the congregation just did it because they were too scared to challenge or question it. But towards the end of his pastorate, it became more difficult and challenging, and he didn't have the best relations with the congregation. And 1991 April Council Minute Notes, he mentions seeking the counsel of Father Lucian of the Franciscan Chapel to provide spiritual leadership to TUC Council, because he admits that he wasn't able to do this adequately. And May 1991 Council Minutes Notes mentions that the past weeks following the congregational meeting has been difficult because the congregation is divided. So I think that is, and he wasn't the only pastor to have kind of a difficulty with the congregation, but I think for churches that are part of a denomination, they kind of help mediate when there's tension between the pastor and the congregation. But because we don't have that, it kind of becomes challenging, and I think that's why you saw help of the Catholic based Lucian and Franciscan Chapel.
Do you know what was dividing, what issue? Or?
Yeah, I heard he might have been like a little autistic. He didn't have the most best emotional intelligence, and he could be a little bit like authoritarian. I think he kind of had the old school pastor model of let pastors know everything. You listen to me, you follow me. So yeah, and then I think he kind of had people he liked. And in the church, so that would be like a little bit divisive. I think pastors are supposed to treat everybody equally. I don't know if he did so. And I think he might have also had a family tragedy during his time here. Family tragedy. He might have lost somebody, maybe a daughter. So yeah, I just heard different people on that. And the personal relations is so important for a successful pastorate. So I don't know. I think he was a brilliant preacher. He knew a lot about worship, but it comes with just interpersonal relations. I don't think he was as a pastor. And that's the book he wrote about participating in worship. And so, yeah, I think in worship he knew how to involve the congregation, but in kind of a day-to-day run of the church, I don't know if he knew how to listen to his congregation. So, but he serves many churches afterwards. He learned something about his time there. So that's the end of chapter 4, and then we get started on chapter 5. And that's kind of a harajuku profession becomes popular in the 1990s. So this is from a BBC article. And apparently this like a fruits fashion magazine did a really good job chronicling the rise of harajuku fashion in 1990s. So that's kind of a roadmap for this chapter. Bill Brainerd, who was the president of TUC in the 1990s. A funeral of Sho Hirayama, who was his husband. Sam Nishiyama, you probably met. Did you get a chance to meet Sam Nishiyama before he passed away? Yeah, he's rolled into the 2000s. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the 90s pop culture and demographic shifts. Pastor Mary, Pastor Jeff, and then annual New Year retreat. Have you been on any of these? Yeah, I think this used to be a big part of a big tradition at TUC. Talk a little bit about the theological diversity at TUC, the mission trip to the Philippines that Richard Foster led, that Pastor Jeff participated in, April Morito nominating elder, share a little bit of her testimony, and then I end with Pastor Gary's sister, who joins us in the late 90s. Will Brainerd was a president in the 90s, and then he first came to Japan with the U.S. Air Force for surveillance in the 1950s during the Cold War. And in 1993, he moves back to Tokyo after an MBA, and he visited numerous times as a consultant. And in the 90s, he becomes a computer systems consultant here. He helps corporations retool their computer systems for the 2000 bug. You probably remember there was a little bit Y2K scare that computers cannot process 2000 or something, and Terrace. And he said in the 90s, I was there during the glorious days of the church, coming to its full size with attendance, outreach, and community engagement. That's why I titled the chapter The Glory Days. And he said he had weekly Bible study breakfast with Pastor Jeff, and then their counterparts at St. Albans Anglican Church and Tokyo Baptist Church. This is St. Albans on the right, on the top, right by Tokyo Tower. And this is the Tokyo Baptist Church in Takayama. And I think that's kind of a fun way to take a picture of the congregation to make everybody see. And I think it just shows how we get more relationships with different English-speaking churches that the pastors and presidents were meeting every week. And Bill says my time in Japan was significant and that it was an end of a generation and the beginning of the next. And the generation that was passing was those who had military experience and remembered World War II. He says he was only 9 when Pearl Harbor happened, but he still remembers it vividly. And he also mentioned that there were a lot of funeral services in the 1990s when he came back after the church was entirely different. And going next to the funeral of Sho Hirayama, because I think it was a kind of a touching story. It captures who we were as a church. And in 1994, Sho was diagnosed with cancer. And they were thinking a Buddhist funeral, because that's the customary in Japan. But they begin to consider a Christian one too. I think Yuriko said the temple was asking for a lot of money because he was a prominent businessman, and that was too much. And then Yuriko also said, yeah, I'm going to heaven, so would you consider a baptism and a memorial service or a funeral at TUC? And Sho says yes, so Pastor Jeff visits and talks with him and prays for him, and Sho's blood sugar level drops. And then Sho starts saying that Pastor Jeff is better than doctors. And then Sho also agrees to a baptism, so Pastor Jeff visited again at night. And for an hour, Pastor Jeff just watched him sleep and prayed for him. And doctor had said that Sho has 3 days, so Pastor Jeff suggested conducting the baptism the next morning because one of their sons was away in Hong Kong, just flying back last minute. And Pastor Jeff told Sho that he will be returning the next morning, and Sho opened his eyes and said thank you, and that was his last words. So he passed away that night before his son could come back and before he could get baptized, but Pastor Jeff still conducted his funeral at church. So Sho had said yes, and this was a picture from the funeral in 1994. Pastor Jeff leading it.
So, basic question, who is Sho right now? Why we focus on Sho?
Oh, that's Yuriko's husband.
And
Yuriko Hirayama was an elder in the 1980s.
I know, okay.
Yeah, she's been at several classes,
Okay.
and she was the first Japanese woman to be an elder.
Oh, she was there 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
was there. Because I think a lot of TUC members, especially if they're Japanese, their spouse may not be Christian. And I think it's kind of, this kind of story shows our openness to, we're not, at least Pastor Jeff wasn't so strict about you have to be baptized to do your funeral at TUC. So, and I also talk about Sen Nishiyama as kind of, he was an icon of the old guard that passed away in the 1990s and 2000s. Because he first comes to TUC in 1936. And there's a record of TUC board approving Sen. Sen requests if he can lead worship for the Nisei, second generation Japanese Americans who have come back to Tokyo. And he starts doing so, and at TUC he meets Shinobu. And Bill told me that Sen fell in love with her charming voice. And Sen ends up serving TUC for more than 6 decades in various roles. He's often interpreting for church events. When we had Who Wrote Silence, Shusaku Endo visit for example, Sam would be the translator. When we had the folk artist, folk Japanese artist, his name is blanking, with his work all over. Do you know the guy I'm talking about? The woodblock print artist? But yeah, his artwork is all around the church. When we had him visit, Sam would serve as a translator, as an interpreter. And Shinobu also served, she had Megumi-san's old job. She was an administrative secretary for over 3 decades. And she actually trained Megumi-san Sam in 1969 becomes a household name in Japan for interpreting simultaneously the Apollo 11 moon landing. And Sam was also an interpreter for many U.S. ambassadors, including Edwin Bashar, who grew up at TUC. His parents were elders, missionaries and elders at TUC. And Sam was an executive at Sony when the Walkman was what every young people had before iPods and iPhones. And I think his life in many ways captures the mission and kind of the vision of TUC, that it was bridge in East and West, and then lettering, I don't know if this can be used as a verb, but kind of heaven and earth. And Bill says Sam was a wonderful, wonderful teacher and storyteller. In the Mishima's old age, Joe Dunkel, TUC elder, becomes their caretakers, and Joe told me that Sam donated everything he had to the church right before he passed away. The Nishiyama studio, next to the children's ministry directors, the children's ministry director next to the man's was donated by Nishiyama's. And 2006, Shinobu passes away. In 2007, Sam passes away, aged 95.
One of the rooms at the man's now is called the San Nishiyama.
Oh, the studio. Attached to that. That's where the children's director lives.
Yeah. That's what you said. Okay.
That's where Pastor Joseph lives now.
Yeah.
And Byron lived there before. And I think that's kind of unusual, right? Because we don't have anything else that's really named after any of our donors. I feel like that could be a good strategy for fundraising. People get more named donations.
But no one says that he donated. They just, well, he gave us, the quote is donated everything.
Yeah.
But no one says, I'm not sure it's written anywhere that he donated an amount for anything. Yeah, I'm just saying the room is named after him, which is very interesting.
Yeah, it's only name space in the church buildings.
Yeah.
So that's Sam, I think, around 2000 at the Mass.
Because unless people want their donation to the public, they don't announce it, right? It's all confidential.
Right. And then I zoom out a little bit afterwards and then kind of talk a little bit about the 90s pop culture and demographic shifts. So those people around this time, those people who remember Pearl Harbor and kind of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they start passing away. And the Japanese who grew up in the 1970s don't really have, like the US troops occupying Japan was no longer a big part of their kind of growing up, but they grow up more with this like a popular culture, consumer culture. 1970s, when Hello Kitty are born. 1980s, Mario and Totoro, the Studio Ghibli studio, were born, and in the 1990s, Pikachu's born. So Japan's military sun had set and its economic sun was setting, but its cultural, it was still a cultural superpower in the 1990s. But you also get demographic shifts. I think many affluent countries go through this, that the woman's birth rate drops from 1.5 children per woman in the 1990s to 1.26 in 2005. And there's also a UN report in 2000 that says Japan would have to bring in more than 500,000 immigrants annually to maintain its workforce size. So that really changes the demographic of the country. And in 1990, there's an immigration reform that makes it easier for the ethnic Japanese overseas to return. And a lot of Japanese Brazilians, I think, come back during this time because Brazil has the largest Japanese community outside of Japan. And in 2005, the number of foreigners in Japan exceeds 2 million. And then the largest of them are from China, the Philippines, and Brazil. And then the international marriages of Japanese citizens also rises to 6% of all marriages. I don't know how that compares to other countries, but it sounds pretty high. And then I talk about Pastor Murray Thorkinson. And in 1992, after Pastor Craig leaves, Pastor Murray is asked to stay on and kind of begin the process of reconciliation and healing at church. And then she said, Paul Fukuda kind of played a major role, elder, in kind of bridging, and trying to kind of get Pastor Craig and then the rest of the church on the same page. And Pastor Murray also mentioned the Women's Society, that how the woman had really helped people together through prayer and conversation during this time. And in 1993, she's a Lutheran, American ELCA, and so her denomination actually invites her to be the interim pastor for healing at the Church of the Redeemer in Jerusalem, because they were having trauma in a divided congregation. And she first comes here in the late 80s, and her first Sunday at TUC, she has shared the story of how she was only pastor on duty. She flew in from Europe, and then she had her passport stolen, so she could only get here Saturday night, and she had to lead communion and worship the next morning. So she goes to the grocery store, and she buys this, what she thought was a hamburger bun, sold in a plastic bag to use during communion. But during her first communion, she heard this big thud, and then the whole sanctuary was laughing, because what she thought was bread was bean paste, and it was like warm and dripping. And then she said, I had no idea what it was and what was going on. It was such a feast of laughter, and it made me feel so relaxed. And so I think that says something about our church, that even if you mess up, it was very forgiving, and people could laugh about it. And during her pastorate, she also invited a Dutch flower artist to install a flower arrangement that goes all the way from the stained glass and up to the balcony. And she said this was love of Christ being poured out as flowers, visualized.
What does TIP stand for, Tokyo TIPS?
This was by the Women's Society. I think this was from like the early 1990s.
Does it sound for like Tokyo International something society or?
No, this was just like a 200-page book that the Women's Society published. And so it was kind of
what's the significance of TIPS though?
It was kind of like the Lonely Planet.
Okay.
It's like a travel guide, or it's just kind of
tips for traveling.
No, just for living in Tokyo.
Just for living in Tokyo.
As a foreign woman. Yeah, this was before the days of internet. And so, they made this. It's a thick book. It's 200 pages of anything from your education for your kids, how to go to hospital, like where to shop, where to eat. So any information that woman. And this was when Women's Society was like 500 members. So, because I think a lot of ex-foreigner women back then came as trailing spouses, so they didn't really have work. So Women's Society provided us a community for them. Where did we get? 10:44. Okay. Should we stop here, or should we end with this slide? I think we can just go over this quickly, and this can be our last slide. And then 1992, Pastor Jeff arrives as the new pastor. So I thought Pastor Barry was one of the most cosmopolitan, Barry Dawson, of pastors, because he served in so many different countries. But Pastor Jeff also, he had traveled to 96 countries before he came to TUC.
As a pilot.
Because his father was a pilot, so I think his father was always taking the kids around a lot. He also studied everywhere at many prestigious universities and seminary. He studied, this is all university level, like Edinburgh, Munich, Pasadena Fuller Seminary, San Francisco Theological Seminary, Strasbourg, and Tübingen. And then his wife Alba was a Guatemalan American, so he brought in a very a cosmopolitan experience, which I think made him a good pastor for a diverse congregation like ours. And he was also picked up on Saturday at the airport by TUC president, but he had to preach the next day, so he kind of hit the ground running. In 1993, he submitted his doctoral dissertation in cross-cultural mission, and Russell told me he had to type the dissertation for the pastor because he didn't really know how to type. And his first stewardship season, he writes in Koinonia magazine that for the 16 years, the most frustrating part of my life has been serving on the payroll of a church at a pledging time. And he was very transparent about his finances. I haven't seen any pastors do this. He said he makes like a 7.8 million yen. That's his salary and housing and everything he gets from TUC. And he dedicates 10% of that salary to the church, and then 90% of his tithing to TUC. And then he added that now my candid hope is that you will do that too. Yeah, I don't know if that's good for our pastor to share how much he makes or not. I don't know if it's an effective kind of fundraising strategy or, but yeah, he wrote that in Koinonia magazine. And his first Valentine's at TUC, he also invited everybody to join Valentine's potluck dinner hosted by the young adults. And then also the Talent and No Talent show. And he wrote, be sure to sign up for the TNT show. Even if you don't consider yourself talented, you can get a few people together for a skit, so I'm planning to. And he and Alma also, I think this was from 1994, they had a country western themed service. So he invited everybody at church to come in, like cowboy boots and then the hats, and 8:30 in the 11 a.m. worship service. There was a country western trio from Disney World, Florida, leading worship, leading gospel music worship. And yeah, so we'll wrap up today. Do you have any questions about it?
Just an observation when you're right, it's interesting that he provides a number for his annual income.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that includes his housing too.
Yeah.
These things like how much was housing of the non, he's giving, well, of the everything, I think, that's what he's saying.
Everything,
Of everything, so that you take out housing and then, it's interesting.
How much would it
And back at that time,
Yeah, that was a lot of money, I think.
but then the property's a lot, for rent is a lot, that's rent though.
Housing a lot, yeah, I think he said that he has like a living allowance, salary, and housing.
All that
all
includes
three
it.
amounts.
So how much of that does that take out for you?
Yeah, so, and have you seen a pastor so openly share his or her salary?
I don't think everything for pledges and for payroll is very confidential. I mean, they show the total amounts and it's in the budget.
Right.
People approve that. They say, oh, here's the number of staff members. Our staff comprises the different positions. But they don't, not that I remember, indicate how much, especially for an
Because
individual.
you've been treasurer.
It's 2 6-year terms. So it is very confidential.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. When I was thinking, can that potentially make some companies like jealous, right? If they're not making.
But then if you look at, that's everything, right?
Yeah, so it's not.
Then you may have it to review.
Right.
I don't know, yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious how his salary affects kind of tithing that season. I think he wants to lead by example, right? Like a little.
That's what he's doing here.
I think. Yeah, I'm walking the talk, but yeah, it's not too much, so yeah. I think I heard Pastor Johan was also very good about typing.
But how do you know?
From, I guess maybe I shouldn't know.
That's right, that's the question.
I shouldn't know, so.
But I heard his salary is lower than other pastors.
How do you know?
Pastor Johan's? Oh, is that right?
That he said. There we go, I don't
Yeah,
know.
maybe we should say, let's not talk about it. I'm just saying historically, he put this in his essay in the Koinonia magazine, so. And I think this would have been fun too, like just country theme, come to dress as like in cowboy jeans and boots and hat.
Well, I'm thinking, I see 1,500 yen and 500 yen, and then what would that be in today's yen?
Right, would that be expensive? Yeah. And then I guess TUC mission projects in Guatemala.
Yes, I Guatemala, yeah.
But is that because his wife is from Guatemala? So is it fair? So,
Yeah, I don't know, when you do the next, like the 2000s and 2010s, I guess, do you touch upon that we had a library?
no, I do that actually like way later.
Very later. Because we used to have a lot of books from the Women's Society.
They
And they gradually got smaller and smaller and smaller, and then I don't even think it's there anymore. It turned into like a small case up, but yeah, it's kind of a transition over time. We've changed. And seeing the pictures of the old mats, you have a picture there. And I think that, you know, the person sitting next to Sandy Shell
No,
is,
who's that?
I think that's Brockford Nunn.
Who's sir?
I think on the left, bottom left.
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
I think that's Brockford Nunn. He's one of the TUCF officers now.
Oh, foundation offices.
Foundation, yeah.
Oh, okay, so he's still,
I'm pretty sure that's him.
wow, it must be pretty.
But that's the old, I think that's the old mats before it got renovated.
Yeah, I think so too. So, yeah, they'll get just a couch. It's very,
I think so.
It's very aged.
Angela and what was the other pastor? Bruce?
Yeah.
Bruce and Angela. I think they lived in there when it was like that.
Oh, I see, so it was renovated for Pastor Derry.
Yeah, I guess so. After the 2000s. I thought it was not so bad, but then everyone's saying, oh, it's old, it's old. I thought it was very nice at the time.
Yeah. And then this was renovated in 2017.
Yeah, so that area there, that little corner, that was all a library.
Oh, yes.
And then a librarian who would, but then somehow there's a connection between the books and Women's Society too, because the Women's Society had their own section. When they did away with that, then a lot of the books, I guess, they went away, went out or passed on, and the fourth floor has books, you see, and then the rest is gone.
Yeah.
If you talk about maybe later, the flea market every year, and the antique furniture sale,
Oh, yes.
those two were
Julie
big
Fukuda
events.
loves those. And then
Yeah,
Julie handles her.
and they got a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff.
Pastor Steve told me he'd get, when he was here, he'd get phone calls about is the flea market still
I
happening.
mean, people contact me about it.
Yeah, me too.
I say, sorry, no. It was a lot. Why I say that is they had racks and racks of books.
Oh, they have books too.
Just once a year that passed on.
Yeah, Pastor Steve told me when he came back in 2019 to visit TUC, just watching the flea market work the same way as it did in the 80s.
Yeah.
There's
There's a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah, and they were like, oh, okay, I can come back to this church as a senior pastor. They still run things the same way.
Interesting.
And I actually got permission from the office and then Ikuko to bring some of the library books down there. I think the first shelf will be the books that I think people may enjoy. Either like browse here or borrow. Because I think it's not good stewardship that we have some good books up in the library.
Yeah.
They're just gathering dust. So
Yeah, bring it down. Or have some new releases or something. That would be good.
yeah. And I think and then people love donating us books that they don't want. The library just fills up with books. Yeah, thank you for coming today.